It's very important for them because it's good for their body.
Lithuania is opening its lasers showroom in Taipei.
Those companies, when they produce their products, they need laser.
It's a joint venture between Lithuanian startup and Taiwanese technology company.
You don't want to doing business with a person or a company you don't trust.
This is the story of how Lithuania became Taiwan's little big best friend.
So you may live in Taipei, Kaohsiung, or anywhere in the world, but become an e-Lithuanian, just like Minister Audrey Tang did last year. Well, I believe that both nations have so many things in common and still many things to be done because obviously China applied coercive measures to Lithuania when the friendship with Taiwan got deeper. And it is our job, both in Lithuania and Taiwan, to make it a success story.
Especially after we felt that some companies who have their counterparts in Lithuania were experiencing the same because they have parts in their production that were produced in our country. And of course this is a interference in EU market, as a matter of fact, because single market is single market and not a third country is there to decide who will invest where and who will have what partners in the European Union.
China banned a number of imports from Lithuania in response to the opening of the Taiwan office in Vilnius, and went as far as banning imports from other European countries if they included components made in Lithuania.
Also, the show how to Lithuanian people to cheers to each other is Vikata. This bar, Lithuanian bar, Little One bar, I opened for almost 5 years. Okay, Little One means first the space here is not so big, small one, small bar, Little One bar, and it sound like Lithuania in Mandarin, you know. Li Tao Wan sounds like a little one, so I named Lithuanian bar as a Little One bar. It's very important for them because it's good for their body, health, and for 1,000 years. It's Vikata. Yes, cheers.
Everybody in Taiwan, we have some kind of, we call it Lasvania fever. All the Taiwanese and the Taiwanese company, they know Lasvania. I put Lasvania as a gateway to the whole Europe. Because everything we have in here, we can very easy and with no resistant to the other European country. Right now, I established the business in here, majorly was in finance, because you know, Lasvania is pretty famous in the fintech area. Fintech is Lasvania, especially Vilnius, is almost the biggest one in Europe.
The Tower of Gediminas, built by a former Grand Duke, the past rulers of Lithuania, is a symbol of Lithuania. Eric Wang is the head of the Taiwan office in Lithuania. This is the man whose nomination has made China so angry.
You can see that they have a very strong sense of identity and they are freedom-loving people. And this Gediminas Tower Castle is also an evidence of their rich culture and long history. So I think this is also an evidence that democratic countries or smaller democracies can work together I added up that the total GDP of those countries that support Lithuania is more than 50% of the world. So this is a very significant case. I think some of the trade has been restored, but it is not restored to the level as it was before.
Lithuania is opening its lasers showroom in Taipei, so we are deepening our economic relations.
And we had a Semicon exhibition. A lot of our laser companies were in town, and for that occasion we were opening the laboratory and also having a seminar for Taiwanese industries by our laser guys. So I had to be here. 95 out of the world's top 100 universities, they have Lithuanian lasers in their labs. I just hope that this friendship will grow. We had this momentum now, and when a lot of awareness was created on both sides. Food is something that you can taste and touch and feel. And I'm very glad to see Lithuanian chocolate here and beers and some other products growing distribution. So I think it's important.
Semiconductors and also PCB manufacturing, those are Taiwanese strengths and expert, right? So everybody knows our TSMC and Foxconn and other big company manufacture your iPhone, your air computers. Those companies, when they produce their products, they need laser. They need laser in processing, they need laser in testing. So we started to find out that the strengths of Lithuania's industry in laser actually can help Taiwanese semiconductor companies and PCB and manufacturing company to develop the next generation of processing and manufacturing technology. You've got a tradition of scientists and engineers working on the laser technology and created an industry.
You can see our original logo, and those little bubbles represent like a shape of Taiwan Islands. More than 50% of our clients, our main target group is between 7 and 17 years old. Like people who can't drink beer, they drink bubble tea. We met in the United States. We studied with Jeffrey as an international student, so we kind of got close from the beginning. And that's where the first time when I tried bubble tea.
Like we first met each other, we just kind of get along really well.
Some brands come and go, they open up, they close down. Like we had some bigger players, but they didn't succeed, I guess.
So here we have 14, we call it racks, growing racks, and they have 14 levels, around 10 meters high. And as you can see that it's a controlled environment, and you can see we have LED lights, provide the kind of artificial sunlight for the plants.
That's roughly 10% of all Lithuanian consumption.
Yes.
Basically 10 warehouses like this would supply all Lithuanian inhabitants. We do vertical farming here in Vilnius in Lithuania. So we are growing leafy greens all year round.
I'm Stella. I'm from a Taiwanese company called Yes Health, and we're founded and based in Taiwan. And we have built this kind of large-scale vertical farm.
This is a kind of a miracle. This is a cold country, especially in the winter. And with Taiwanese technology, it's a joint venture between Lithuanian startup and Taiwanese technology company.
I think we're working at ethics, that's for sure. Like good attitude towards work and people. I think this is quite important for the business. Like daily operations. But also I think friendliness is something that also, even I would say surprises on the regular basis.
The food safety, food resilience. I think this is something that Taiwan, with the cooperation between Lithuania and Taiwan.
Many Taiwanese want to give back to Lithuania for its support, but the dangers faced by Taiwan and Lithuania could require more than commercial exchanges between small shops or big tech businesses.
The major difference from myself is we becoming real friends from the heart. Doing business, I always say that doing business, what is most important? The most important is credit and the trust. Because you definitely don't want to doing business with a person or a company you don't trust.
I feel that Taiwan has been through a lot. It's like what happened with Lithuania and countries in this region, and in Baltics and in the CE region. Taiwan has come to a stage that with our resources and our experiences, and we feel that we are lucky. We're pretty lucky. Things could have gone wrong in the past 30, 40, 50 years and dragged Taiwan into some sort of miserable situation, but it didn't happen. So it's time for Taiwanese to come to this region to share what we've been blessed with.
Taiwan as an independent state which has no claims to anybody.
How Taiwan itself is learning from the situation in Europe.
And in this preparation is involved 60 municipalities in Lithuania and 14 ministries, and
let more and more people know about this beautiful country and nice people who live there.